The black silk rustled against Joan Miller's trembling legs as she stood on the wooden platform, her morning dress a stark contrast to the harsh mountain sunlight beating down on the crowd below. The fabric clung to her frame, still carrying the scent of the funeral parlor where she had said goodbye to her husband just 3 weeks prior. Now she was saying goodbye to everything else. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the dusty square, his words cutting through her like winter wind. "What am I bid for this fine specimen? Young widow, 24 years old, good for cooking, cleaning, and bearing children. Starting bid is $50. Joan's hands shook as she gripped the folds of her dress tighter. The faces in the crowd blurred together, a sea of leering men and disapproving women. Some pointed at her morning attire with whispered comments she was grateful she couldn't hear clearly. Others examined her like livestock, their eyes calculating her worth in ways that made her stomach turn. She had never imagined it would come to this. When Thomas died in the mine collapse, she thought the worst of her suffering was behind her. The grief had been overwhelming, yes, but she had believed she could manage on her own. She had been wrong. The debts Thomas had hidden from her came flooding in like a dam burst, drowning her in obligations she could never hope to meet. The company store, the doctor bills, the funeral expenses, all of it adding up to more than she could earn in a lifetime of taking in, washing, and mending. The sheriff had been kind but firm when he delivered the news. Either she found a way to pay what was owed, or she would be sold to settle the debt. It was legal, he assured her, though his eyes couldn't meet hers when he said it. Debt bondage, they called it, a practice that turned desperate people into property until their obligations were satisfied. "Do I hear 60? The auctioneer called out, his voice growing more animated as hands began to rise in the crowd. Joan closed her eyes and tried to remember Thomas's voice, the way he used to whisper her name in the morning when he thought she was still sleeping. The memory felt like a lifetime ago, though it had been less than a month. Everything had changed so quickly, her world collapsing like the mine shaft that had claimed her husband's life. 75, thank you, sir. Do I hear 80? A rough voice from the back of the crowd caught her attention, different from the others, somehow. What's her debt total? The auctioneer paused, consulting his papers. $237, including fees and interest. Joan opened her eyes and searched the crowd for the source of the voice. She found him standing apart from the others, a tall man with dark hair and weathered features. He wore simple clothes, a worn leather jacket and sturdy boots that spoke of a life lived outdoors. There was something in his expression that set him apart from the other bidders, a gravity that made her heart skip strangely. "I'll take the whole debt," the man said, his voice carrying easily across the square despite its quiet tone. The crowd murmured in surprise. It was unusual for someone to bid the full amount rather than trying to get a bargain. The auctioneer looked momentarily flustered. "Sir, the bidding hasn't reached that level yet. We're only at $80. 237, the man repeated, stepping forward. Cash. Joan felt something shift in the air around her, a change in the quality of attention from the crowd. This wasn't how these things usually went. Men came to these auctions looking for cheap labor, or worse, not to pay full price for a stranger's debt. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The auctioneer cleared his throat and looked around the crowd one more time, going once for the full debt amount, going twice. His gavel hung in the air for a moment before coming down with a sharp crack. Sold to the gentleman in the leather jacket. Joan's legs nearly gave out beneath her. It was done. She belonged to a stranger now, a man whose name she didn't even know. The crowd began to disperse, some looking disappointed at missing their chance, others shaking their heads at what they clearly considered foolish generosity. The man approached the platform slowly, his boots echoing on the wooden steps as he climbed up to where she stood. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, the way his hands bore calluses from hard work. He was older than she had first thought, perhaps in his 30s, with a quiet strength that reminded her somehow of the mountains themselves. "My name is Kevin Young," he said, his voice gentle despite its roughness. "What do they call you?" "Joan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Joan Miller." He nodded as if her name carried weight with him. "Joan Miller. That's a good name." He paused, studying her face with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable but somehow wasn't. You can keep wearing that dress if you want to. I'm mourning too. The words hit her like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were kind. In all the weeks since Thomas's death, no one had acknowledged her grief as anything more than an inconvenience. The dress had become a target for criticism, people telling her it was time to move on, to stop dwelling on the past. But this stranger, this man who had just bought her debt and her freedom, understood something the others had missed. "Thank you," she managed, though the words felt inadequate for what he had just given her. Kevin reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather pouch, counting out bills with practiced efficiency. The auctioneer waited nearby, clearly eager to complete the transaction and move on to the next lot. There was always more human misery to be sold in these mountain towns. "The papers say you can cook," Kevin said as he handed over the money. It wasn't really a question, but Joan nodded anyway. "Yes, sir, and I can sew and tend a garden and keep house." The words came out in a rush, as if proving her worth might somehow change the nature of what had just happened. "Good." He folded the receipt the auctioneer handed him and tucked it into his pocket. "My cabin's about a day's ride from here. You got anything you need to collect?" Joan shook her head. Everything she had owned of value had already been sold to try to pay the debts. The dress on her back and a small bundle of personal items were all that remained of her former life. Kevin seemed to understand without her having to explain. He gestured toward a horse tied to a post near the edge of the square, a sturdy-looking animal with kind eyes. "Can you ride?" "A little," Joan admitted. Thomas had taught her the basics, though they had never owned a horse of their own. "You'll learn more." Kevin stepped back, giving her space to move. "We should get going. Weather's been unpredictable lately, and I'd rather not get caught in a storm on the mountain roads." As they walked toward the horse, Joan felt the eyes of the remaining townspeople following them. She could imagine their whispered conversations, the speculation about what kind of man paid full price for a woman's debt and what he might expect in return. The thought made her stomach clench with fear and something else she couldn't quite name. Kevin untied the horse and checked the saddle with practiced movements. "You ever been up in the high country?" "No, sir." Joan had lived her entire life in the valley, first with her parents and then with Thomas. The mountains had always been a distant presence, beautiful but remote. "It's different up there," Kevin said, offering her his hand to help her mount. "Quieter. People tend to mind their own business more." Joan accepted his assistance, settling herself as best she could on the horse's back. The animal stood patiently, as if accustomed to carrying nervous passengers. Kevin swung up behind her, his presence solid and reassuring, despite the strangeness of their situation. "Hold on," he said simply, and urged the horse forward. As they rode through the town and up into the foothills, Joan found herself studying the landscape with new eyes. Everything looked different now that she was leaving it behind, perhaps forever. The familiar buildings and streets took on the quality of a memory, even as she was still seeing them. The horse's steady gait was soothing, and she gradually relaxed against Kevin's solid presence behind her. He didn't try to make conversation, seeming content to let the silence stretch between them. It was a comfortable quiet, different from the oppressive atmosphere of the auction or the pitying look she had endured in recent weeks. The road began to climb more steeply as they left the valley behind. Pine trees pressed close on either side, their branches creating a canopy that filtered the sunlight into shifting patterns of gold and green. The air grew cooler and thinner, carrying scents Joan had never noticed before. Pine sap and wildflowers, clean stone, and something indefinably wild. "You doing all right?" Kevin asked after they had been riding for perhaps an hour. "Yes, sir." Joan was surprised to find that she meant it. Despite everything that had happened, despite the uncertainty of her future, there was something peaceful about being on the mountain road with this quiet stranger. "Kevin," he said. "Just Kevin. No need for the sir business." Joan nodded, though she wasn't sure she could manage such informality just yet. She had been raised to show proper respect, and the events of the day had left her feeling unmoored from all her usual social anchors. They continued climbing, the road winding back and forth across the face of the mountain. Occasionally they would round a bend, and Joan would catch glimpses of the valley below, growing smaller and more distant with each mile. The sight should have been frightening, but instead she found it oddly liberating. Whatever lay ahead, it couldn't be worse than what she was leaving behind. The man who died, Kevin said suddenly, his voice careful. Your husband. What was his name? Thomas, Joan replied, surprised by how easily she could say it. For weeks, speaking his name had felt like swallowing glass. Thomas Miller. He worked in the copper mine. The collapse 3 weeks back? Joan nodded, not trusting her voice. I heard about that. Bad business. Kevin was quiet for a moment. Lost my wife 2 winters ago. Fever took her. The simple statement carried more weight than all the elaborate condolences Joan had received. This man understood her loss in a way the others couldn't, had walked the same dark path she was still navigating. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it. Her name was Sarah, Kevin continued. She would have liked you, I think. She always said a person's character shows in how they carry their grief. Joan felt tears threatening and blinked them back. She had cried enough in recent weeks, and something about this man's quiet strength made her want to match it with her own. The road leveled out somewhat as they reached a plateau, and Kevin guided the horse toward a small stream that bubbled down from higher up the mountain. We'll rest here for a bit. Let the horse drink. He dismounted first, then helped Joan down. Her legs were unsteady from the unaccustomed riding, and she was grateful for his steadying hand. The stream was crystal clear, so different from the muddy water that ran through the valley below. It's beautiful, Joan said, kneeling beside the water to splash some on her face. Gets more so the higher you go, Kevin replied, loosening the horse's bit so it could drink more easily. My place is another few hours up. Small cabin, but it's sturdy and warm. Joan watched him tend to the horse with gentle efficiency. His movements were economical and sure, speaking of years of experience in caring for animals and living off the land. She found herself wondering what his life had been like before today. What had brought him to that auction square with enough money to buy a stranger's freedom? Why did you do it? She asked suddenly, the question escaping before she could stop herself. Kevin looked up from adjusting the saddle. Do what? Pay my debt. You could have let someone else bid, gotten me for less money. He was quiet for a long moment, his hands stilling on the leather straps. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. I've been to those auctions before, seen what usually happens to women who end up there. He met her eyes directly. Figured you deserve better than that. You don't even know me. I know enough. Kevin's expression was serious. I know you're wearing mourning clothes 3 weeks after your husband died, which means you loved him. I know you're scared, but you're not broken, which means you're stronger than you think. And I know you said thank you when I told you to keep the dress, which means you've got manners and gratitude even when your world's falling apart. Joan felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. This man saw her as a person, not just a burden to be managed or a commodity to be used. What do you expect from me? She asked quietly. Kevin finished with the saddle and straightened, considering her question. Honest work for honest wages, help around the place, cooking, maybe some hoeing if you're willing. Nothing you wouldn't do for family. And after, when the debt is paid, after you're free to go wherever you want. I'll even help you get there if you need it. The simplicity of his answer was almost harder to believe than cruelty would have been. Joan had learned to expect the worst from people, especially men, especially in situations where she had no power. But Kevin Young seemed to operate by different rules, ones she was still trying to understand. We should keep moving, Kevin said, glancing at the sky. Clouds are building up over the peaks. Don't want to get caught in weather. As they remounted and continued up the mountain road, Joan found herself thinking about the strange turn her life had taken. This morning she had woken up in a boarding house, preparing for what she thought would be the worst day of her life. Now she was riding into unknown country with a man who had shown her more kindness in a few hours than she had received in weeks. The road grew narrower and more challenging as they climbed higher. In some places it was barely wide enough for the horse, with steep drops on one side and sheer rock faces on the other. Joan tried not to look down at the valleys far below, focusing instead on the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves and Kevin's reassuring presence behind her. Almost there, Kevin said as they rounded another switchback. See that smoke? Joan followed his pointing finger and saw a thin column of smoke rising from somewhere ahead, barely visible against the darkening sky. The sight of it filled her with an unexpected sense of homecoming, though she had never seen this place before in her life. The cabin appeared suddenly as they crested a small rise, nestled in a clearing surrounded by tall pines. It was larger than Joan had expected, built of solid logs with a stone chimney and a covered porch that looked out over the valley below. Smoke rose from the chimney and warm light glowed in the windows. "Someone's here," Joan observed, noting the signs of habitation. "My neighbor, Benjamin Alvarez," Kevin explained as they rode into the yard. "Asked him to keep an eye on the place while I was gone. He probably started a fire when he saw the weather changing." As if summoned by their arrival, a man emerged from the cabin. He was shorter than Kevin, but built like a tree trunk, with graying hair and kind eyes. His face lit up when he saw them approaching. "Kevin, about time you got back. Storm's coming in fast." Benjamin's gaze shifted to Joan, taking in her morning dress and the circumstances of her arrival without comment. "Ma'am, Benjamin, this is Joan Miller," Kevin said as he helped her down from the horse. "Joan, Benjamin's been my neighbor for about 5 years now, lives about a mile up the ridge." "Pleased to meet you," Joan said, grateful that Benjamin didn't seem inclined to ask awkward questions about her presence. "Likewise," Benjamin turned back to Kevin. "Got your fire going and brought in some supplies. Weather's been strange lately, and I had a feeling you might need them." "Appreciate it." Kevin began unsaddling the horse. "How strange?" "Snow 2 days ago, then warm enough to melt it all yesterday. Now it looks like we might get both rain and snow tonight." Benjamin glanced at the darkening skies. "I'd better get home to my own place before it starts." As Benjamin prepared to leave, Joan found herself studying the cabin that was apparently to be her new home. It looked solid and well-maintained, with a small garden plot to one side and what appeared to be a workshop or barn behind the main structure. The setting was isolated but not lonely, with spectacular views in every direction. "Joan," Kevin called, drawing her attention back to the present. "Why don't you go inside and get warm? I'll tend to the horse and be in shortly." Joan nodded and made her way to the cabin door, her heart beating faster with each step. Whatever came next, this was the beginning of a new chapter in her life. As she reached for the door handle, she heard the first rumble of thunder echoing off the mountain peaks. The storm Kevin had worried about was finally arriving, and Joan Miller was about to discover that some storms bring not just destruction, but the possibility of something entirely new growing in their wake. Inside the cabin, Joan found herself in a main room that was both rustic and comfortable. The fire Benjamin had started crackled warmly in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on log walls that had been chinked and finished with care. Simple furniture filled the space: a sturdy table and chairs, a rocking chair near the fire, shelves lined with books and practical items. Everything spoke of a man who valued function over decoration, but took pride in craftsmanship. Joan moved slowly around the room, taking in details that told her about the man who had bought her freedom. The book surprised her. She could see volumes on everything from farming techniques to poetry. A rifle hung over the fireplace, clean and well-maintained, but not displayed like a trophy. In one corner stood a spinning wheel, dusty from disuse but still in good condition. The sound of the door opening made her turn as Kevin entered, shaking raindrops from his jacket. The storm had arrived with mountain suddenness, and she could hear wind beginning to howl around the cabin's solid walls. "Good timing," Kevin said, hanging his jacket on a peg by the door. "Going to be a rough night." Joan nodded, suddenly feeling awkward in the domestic space. During the ride up the mountain, the strangeness of their situation had been buffered by movement and purpose. Now, standing in what was presumably going to be her home for the foreseeable future, the reality of her circumstances pressed down on her like the storm clouds outside. Kevin seemed to sense her discomfort. "You must be hungry. It's been a long day." "I can cook," Joan offered quickly, "if you show me where things are." "Kitchen's through there," Kevin pointed to a doorway at the back of the main room. "But you don't need to start working tonight. You've had enough upheaval for one day." Joan shook her head. "I'd rather keep busy if you don't mind. It helps." Kevin studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "I understand. Sarah used to say the same thing when she was troubled about something." The mention of his late wife sent a pang through Joan's chisel. She was stepping into a space that had belonged to another woman, a woman Kevin had clearly loved deeply. The thought made her feel like an intruder, despite the circumstances that had brought her here. The kitchen was small but well-appointed, with a wood-burning stove, a pump for water, and shelves stocked with basic supplies. Joan found flour, salt, dried beans, and preserved meat, enough to make a simple but filling meal. As she worked, she could hear Kevin moving around in the main room, adding wood to the fire and preparing for the storm. Cooking felt like a return to normalcy, something familiar in a day full of strangeness. Her hands moved automatically through the motions of preparing bread and setting beans to soak. The rhythmic work calmed her nerves and gave her something to focus on besides the uncertain future stretching ahead. "Smells good," Kevin said from the doorway, making her jump slightly. "Just simple fare," Joan replied, wiping her hands on a towel she had found. "Nothing fancy." "Simple's good. I'm not much of a cook myself." Kevin leaned against the doorframe, watching her work. "Sarah tried to teach me, but I never quite got the hang of it." Joan felt that pang again at the mention of his wife. "How long were you married?" 8 years. Kevin's voice grew soft. "Met her when I first came up to the mountains. She was teaching school in a little settlement about 10 miles from here." "She was a teacher?" "Best one those kids ever had. Taught me to read better too, though I was too proud to admit I needed the help at first." Kevin smiled at the memory. She had a way of making learning feel like a gift instead of a chore. Joan could picture it, a young woman in a one-room schoolhouse, patiently working with mountain children who might not see the value in book learning. It took a special kind of person to choose such a life, and Joan felt a stab of inadequacy thinking about following in such footsteps. "What happened to the school when she died?" Joan asked. "Closed down. The settlement couldn't find another teacher willing to come up this high, and most of the families eventually moved down to the valley where their children could get proper schooling." The sadness in Kevin's voice made Joan want to comfort him somehow, but she didn't know what words could ease such a loss. Instead, she continued working, letting the silence stretch between them in what she hoped was a companionable way. Outside, the storm was intensifying. Rain lashed against the windows, and Joan could hear branches creaking in the wind. The sound made her grateful for the solid walls around them and the warm fire in the next room. "You ever been in a mountain storm before?" Kevin asked, apparently following her thoughts. "No, are they always this violent?" "This time of year they can be. Weather changes fast up here, and when it changes, it doesn't do anything halfway." Kevin moved to look out the kitchen window at the darkness beyond. "But the cabin's weathered worse than this. Built it to last." "You built this place yourself?" "Most of it. Benjamin helped with the heavy lifting, and Sarah designed the kitchen layout." Kevin turned back to her. "She said a kitchen should be a place where a woman could work comfortably, not just an afterthought tacked onto a man's idea of a house." Joan looked around the space with new appreciation. The height of the counters, the placement of the windows for good light, the efficient arrangement of storage, all of it spoke of thoughtful planning by someone who understood the work that happened in such a space. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman," Joan said softly. She was. Kevin was quiet for a moment. "I think she would have understood what happened today. Why I did what I did." Joan felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You don't need to explain yourself to me." "Maybe not, but I want to." Kevin moved closer, his expression serious. "I've seen too many women end up in situations they couldn't escape from, especially after they lost their husbands. The system's designed to trap people, and once you're caught, it's almost impossible to get free." "So you make a habit of buying women at debt auctions?" Joan asked, then immediately regretted the sharp tone in her voice. Kevin didn't take offense. "No, you're the first. But I've been thinking about it for a while, ever since I heard about how these things work. Seemed like there ought to be someone willing to offer a different kind of arrangement." Joan studied his face, trying to understand the man who had so dramatically altered her life. "What kind of arrangement is that exactly?" "The kind where you get to choose what happens next," Kevin said simply. "Work if you want to work, leave if you want to leave, be treated like a person instead of property." The words hit Joan harder than she expected. For weeks, she had felt like she was drowning, pulled down by circumstances beyond her control. The idea that she might have choices again, that someone might see her as more than just a burden or a commodity, was almost too much to hope for. Thunder crashed overhead, so loud it seemed to shake the cabin's foundation. Joan instinctively moved closer to Kevin, seeking the comfort of human presence in the face of the storm's fury. "It's all right," Kevin said quietly. "We're safe here." But even as he spoke the reassuring words, Joan heard something else in the storm's voice, something that made her blood run cold. Mixed in with the thunder and wind was another sound, one that didn't belong to any natural weather. Voices, human voices, calling out in the darkness. Kevin heard it too. His body went tense and he moved quickly to the window, peering out into the storm-lashed night. "What is it?" Joan whispered, though some instinct told her she already knew. "Riders," Kevin said grimly, "coming up the mountain road in this weather. That means they're either desperate or they're looking for something specific." Joan's heart began to pound as the implications sank in. "You think they're looking for me?" Kevin was already moving, pulling the rifle down from over the fireplace and checking to make sure it was loaded. "Could be. Some folks at that auction might have had second thoughts about letting you go for full price. Might have decided to try and collect their own compensation." The voices were getting closer now, and Joan could make out individual words carried on the wind. Her name, descriptions of her appearance, crude speculation about what Kevin might be planning to do with his purchase. "What do we do?" Joan asked, her voice barely audible over the storm. Kevin checked the rifle one more time, then moved to blow out the lamps, plunging the cabin into darkness except for the flickering firelight. "We wait, and we see what they want." But Joan already knew what they wanted. They wanted her. And as the sound of horses' hooves grew louder in the yard outside, she realized that her ordeal was far from over. The storm had brought more than just wind and rain to Kevin Young's mountain sanctuary. It had brought the kind of men who saw a woman alone as prey, and a man's kindness as weakness to be exploited. Joan pressed herself against the kitchen wall, her morning dress rustling softly in the darkness, and wondered if she would live to see another dawn. The voices outside grew louder, cutting through the storm like knives through silk. Joan pressed herself against the kitchen wall, her black dress seeming to absorb what little light remained from the dying fire. Through the window, she could see the flickering glow of torches moving erratically in the wind and rain. "Joan Miller," a voice bellowed from the darkness. "We know you're in there. Come out and we can settle this peaceful-like." Kevin moved silently to Joan's side, the rifle held low but ready. His face was grim in the firelight, and she could see the tension in his shoulders. This was not how he had planned for their first night to go. "Who is it?" Joan whispered, though part of her already suspected. "Frank Harris, most likely," Kevin replied quietly. "He was at the auction today, bidding on you until I stepped in. Runs a logging operation down in the valley, and he's got a reputation for taking what he thinks he's owed." Joan's blood ran cold. She remembered Frank Harris now, a burly man with cruel eyes who had looked at her like she was livestock. He had been bidding aggressively until Kevin's offer of the full debt amount had shut down the auction entirely. "What's he want?" Joan asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Probably figures he can intimidate me into selling you to him for what he was willing to pay. Some men don't like being shown up in public, especially by someone they don't know." The sound of boots on the porch made them both freeze. Someone was trying the door handle, testing to see if it was locked. Kevin had secured it when he came in from tending the horse, but the simple latch wouldn't hold against determined men for long. "Young!" Frank Harris's voice was closer now, just outside the main door. "I'm willing to be reasonable here. You paid too much for that woman, and we both know it. I'll give you $100 for her, and we'll call it square." Kevin's jaw tightened. "Stay here," he whispered to Joan, then moved toward the main room. "I'm not interested in selling," Kevin called out, his voice carrying clearly through the door. "The transaction's done, legal and proper." Harsh laughter greeted this response. "Legal maybe, but not smart. You're new to these parts, young. Don't know how things work. That woman's got debts beyond what you paid. Debts to people who don't take kindly to being cheated." Joan felt her heart sink. More debts? Thomas had hidden so much from her, but surely she would have known if there were other obligations outstanding. Unless Frank Harris was simply lying, trying to create a justification for what he planned to do. "What debts?" Kevin demanded. "She owes my company for supplies her husband took on credit. $50 worth of tools and materials he never paid for before he got himself killed in that mine. Frank's voice carried a note of satisfaction, as if he had been waiting to spring this trap. Makes her my property by rights. Joan closed her eyes, trying to remember. Had Thomas bought tools from Harris Logging? It was possible. In the weeks before his death, Thomas had been talking about starting his own small operation, maybe doing some timber work to supplement their income from the mine. He could have made arrangements she knew nothing about. You got papers to prove this debt? Kevin asked. Don't need papers for a handshake deal. Your woman's husband knew what he owed, and now she's responsible for making good on it. The wind howled around the cabin, and Joan could hear other voices murmuring in the yard. Frank Harris hadn't come alone. She counted at least 3 distinct voices, maybe more. Kevin was outnumbered, and they both knew it. Even if what you're saying is true, Kevin said carefully, that's a matter for the courts to decide. You can't just take her. More laughter, uglier this time. Courts are a long way from here, young, and winter's coming on. Lot can happen before spring and thaw makes the roads passable again. The threat was clear. Up here in the mountains, isolated from law and civilization, Frank Harris and his men could do whatever they wanted. By the time spring came and outside authorities could investigate, any evidence of wrongdoing would be long gone. Joan heard the scrape of boots on wood, and more men climbed onto the porch. They were positioning themselves, getting ready for whatever came next. Her mouth went dry as she realized how vulnerable they were. Tell you what, Frank continued, his voice taking on a false reasonableness. I'm a fair man. I'll give you till morning to think it over. But come sunrise, that woman comes with us, one way or another. And if I refuse, then we'll take her anyway, and you can explain to the sheriff next spring how you got yourself shot defending stolen property. Joan pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a gasp. They were talking about murder as casually as discussing the weather. These were not men who would be deterred by moral arguments or legal technicalities. The sound of retreating footsteps suggested the men were withdrawing, but Joan could still hear voices in the yard. They weren't leaving entirely, just pulling back to wait out the storm and plan their next move. Kevin returned to the kitchen, his face pale in the dim light. They're making camp in the barn, he reported quietly. Settling in for the night. Is it true, Joan asked, about Thomas owing money to Frank Harris? Kevin studied her face. Does it matter? True or not, they're not going to let legal niceties stop them from taking what they want. Joan sank into a chair, the weight of despair settling over her like a shroud. Just when she had begun to hope that her nightmare was over, it was starting all over again. Worse, she had dragged Kevin into danger through no fault of his own. I should go with them, she said quietly. It's not fair to put you at risk for my problems. No, Kevin's voice was firm. That's not happening. But they'll kill you if you try to stop them. Maybe, or maybe there's another way. Kevin moved to the window, peering out at the storm. How well do you know these mountains? Not at all. I've never been up here before today. Kevin nodded thoughtfully. That might actually work in our favor. They'll expect us to try to get down to the valley, back to civilization. But there are other ways to go, paths that lead deeper into the high country. In this weather, we'd freeze to death. Not if we make it to Benjamin's place. He's got supplies cached all through these mountains, knows every trail and shelter for 50 miles around. Kevin turned back to her. It's dangerous, but it's better than the alternative. Joan looked at this man who had already sacrificed so much for her, who was now proposing to risk his life again, rather than simply hand her over to Frank Harris. The magnitude of his kindness was almost overwhelming. Why are you doing this? She asked. You barely know me. Kevin was quiet for a long moment. Because Sarah would have expected it of me. Because it's the right thing to do. And because I've seen what men like Frank Harris do to women who can't protect themselves. The simple honesty of his answer cut through Joan's despair like sunlight through clouds. Here was a man who acted on principle rather than convenience, who saw her as worth protecting even when it would cost him dearly. What do we need to do? Pack light and warm, food for a few days, blankets, anything that might help us survive in the mountains until we can figure out a more permanent solution. Kevin moved to a cabinet and began pulling out supplies. The storm will provide cover for our escape, but it'll also make the journey more dangerous. Joan nodded and began gathering what she could from the kitchen. Her hands shook as she worked, but she forced herself to focus on the task rather than the fear. She had survived Thomas's death in the humiliation of the auction. She could survive this too. As she packed, she found herself thinking about the spinning wheel in the main room, dusty from disuse since Sarah's death. There was something poignant about leaving behind the tools and comforts of domestic life for the harsh uncertainty of the mountain wilderness. But perhaps that was fitting. Her old life was gone anyway, destroyed by circumstances beyond her control. Maybe it was time to discover what kind of person she could become when stripped of everything familiar. "Ready?" Kevin asked, shouldering a pack loaded with supplies. Joan nodded, pulling her black shawl tighter around her shoulders. The mourning dress that had marked her as a widow would now serve as camouflage in the darkness. Kevin moved to the door, listening carefully for sounds from outside. The storm was still raging, which would help mask their movements, but also make travel treacherous. "The back window," he whispered. "We'll go out through the kitchen and circle around behind the cabin. Stay close and step where I step." Joan followed him to the small window at the back of the kitchen. Kevin eased it open, wincing as the wind immediately drove rain into the room. He climbed through first, then helped Joan follow. The storm hit them like a physical blow the moment they stepped outside. Rain lashed at their faces, and the wind was so strong Joan had to grab Kevin's arm to keep from being knocked over. The darkness was absolute, except for brief moments when lightning illuminated the landscape in stark white relief. Kevin led her away from the cabin, moving carefully through the trees behind the house. Joan could barely see him, even though he was just inches ahead of her, and she had to trust completely in his knowledge of the terrain. They had gone perhaps 100 yards when Joan heard shouts from the direction of the cabin. Had Frank Harris's men seen them leaving, or were they just checking to make sure their quarry was still inside? Kevin pulled her down behind a fallen log, both of them breathing hard from the exertion of fighting through the storm. Joan's dress was already soaked through, and she could feel the cold beginning to seep into her bones. "Change of plans," Kevin whispered, his mouth close to her ear so she could hear him over the wind. "They're more alert than I expected. We'll have to go the long way around." Joan nodded, not trusting her voice. The long way around sounded ominous in weather like this, but she had committed herself to trusting Kevin's judgment. They continued through the forest, moving slowly and carefully to avoid making noise that might carry back to the men at the cabin. The going was treacherous, with fallen branches and hidden rocks threatening to trip them at every step. More than once Joan stumbled, only Kevin's steady hand keeping her from falling. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, they emerged onto what appeared to be a trail. Kevin paused, getting his bearings in the darkness. "This leads up to the ridge," he explained quietly. "Benjamin's place is about 2 miles along the ridgeline. Hard going in this weather, but it should keep us away from Harris's men." Joan looked up the trail, which disappeared into the storm-lashed darkness above them. 2 miles had never seemed like such an impossible distance. "Can you make it?" Kevin asked, and she could hear the concern in his voice. "I'll make it," Joan replied, surprised by the determination in her own voice. She had come too far to give up now. They began the climb up the ridge, fighting against wind that seemed determined to push them back down the mountain. The trail was slippery with rain and fallen leaves, and Joan's dress kept catching on branches and rocks. But she pressed on, driven by the knowledge that Frank Harris and his men were somewhere behind them in the darkness. The higher they climbed, the worse the weather became. What had been rain at the cabin elevation was turning to sleet, then to wet snow that clung to everything it touched. Joan's hands were numb with cold, and she could no longer feel her feet in her thin shoes. "Not much further," Kevin called back to her, though she could barely hear him over the howling wind. Joan didn't have breath to reply. She focused all her energy on putting one foot in front of the other, following the dim shape of Kevin's back through the swirling snow. Her mourning dress, so carefully chosen to show respect for Thomas's memory, was now a sodden burden that seemed to grow heavier with every step. Just when she thought she couldn't go another yard, she saw a faint glow ahead through the trees. Benjamin's cabin appeared like a beacon in the storm, warm light spilling from its windows onto the snow-covered ground. Kevin pounded on the door and it opened almost immediately. Benjamin Alvarez stood silhouetted in the doorway, a rifle in his hands and a grim expression on his weathered face. "Figured you might be coming," he said without preamble. Saw Harris and his boys heading up the mountain road about 2 hours ago. Come in, both of you, before you freeze to death. Joan stumbled into the warmth of Benjamin's cabin, her legs finally giving out as the adrenaline that had carried her through the climb suddenly abandoned her. She found herself on the floor shaking uncontrollably as feeling began to return to her frozen limbs. Get her by the fire, Benjamin instructed Kevin. I'll put coffee on. She's got hypothermia starting. Kevin helped Joan to a chair near Benjamin's fireplace, wrapping blankets around her shaking form. The warmth was almost painful after the bitter cold of the mountain trail, but gradually the violent shivering began to subside. How did you know we were coming? Kevin asked as Benjamin busied himself with the coffee. Harris came by here first, asking if I'd seen a woman in mourning clothes. When I said no, he got suspicious, started asking questions about you and where your cabin was. Benjamin glanced at Joan, who was slowly beginning to recover. Man's got a reputation for taking what he wants. Law or no law? He claims Joan's husband owed him money, Kevin explained. Benjamin snorted. Frank Harris claims a lot of things, usually right before he tries to steal something that doesn't belong to him. He handed Joan a cup of hot coffee, and she wrapped her numb fingers around it gratefully. So what's the plan? Benjamin continued. Can't stay here long. Harris will figure out eventually that you came this way. Kevin looked at Joan, who was finally able to speak again. How far could we get before they track us down? Depends on how determined they are and how smart we are about covering our trail, Benjamin replied. But in weather like this, with winter coming on, there aren't many places to go. Joan sipped the coffee, and feeling strength slowly returning to her body. What if I just went back, faced whatever Frank Harris has planned? Both men looked at her as if she had suggested jumping off a cliff. That's not an option, Kevin said firmly. Why not? If he really believes Thomas owed him money, maybe we could work something out. I could work for him until the debt is paid. Benjamin and Kevin exchanged a look that made Joan's stomach clench with dread. Joan, Benjamin said gently, Frank Harris doesn't want you to work off a debt. Men like him don't buy women at auctions to put them to work in the kitchen. The implication hit Joan like a physical blow. She had been naive to think this was really about money Thomas might have owed. Frank Harris wanted her for the same reason most men bid at debt auctions, and the supposed debt was just an excuse to take what he wanted. Then what do we do? She asked quietly. Kevin was studying a map Benjamin had spread on the table. There's a settlement about 30 miles north of here across the high pass. It's rough country, but if we could make it there, Harris wouldn't be able to follow without risking a confrontation with people who know how to fight back. 30 miles in this weather? Joan looked at the snow still swirling outside Benjamin's windows. Is that even possible? Barely, Benjamin admitted, but it might be the only choice you've got. Harris has friends throughout this part of the territory. Nowhere close by is going to be safe for long. Joan set down her coffee cup and looked at the two men who were risking everything to help her. Kevin had already paid her debt and offered her sanctuary. Benjamin was preparing to aid in her escape despite the danger it would bring to his own door. She couldn't ask them to do more. I'll go alone, she said. You've both done enough. No, Kevin's voice brooked no argument. We're in this together now. But why die? I'm nothing to you, but just a stranger you met at an auction. Why would you risk your life for someone you don't even know? Kevin was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on the fire crackling in Benjamin's hearth. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but certain. Because Sarah taught me that how we treat people when they can't help themselves says everything about who we really are. Because you deserve better than what Frank Harris has planned. And because sometimes doing the right thing is more important than doing the safe thing. Joan felt tears threaten, not from sadness, but from a gratitude so profound it threatened to overwhelm her. In the space of a single day, this man had shown her more kindness than she had experienced in months of grief and desperation. When do we leave? She asked. Benjamin looked out at the storm, then back at the map. Dawn, if the weather breaks, we'll need every hour of daylight to make it across the pass before dark. And if the weather doesn't break, then we wait and hope Harris doesn't find us first. As if summoned by his words, the sound of voices drifted through the storm from somewhere down the mountain. Faint but unmistakable. growing closer. Benjamin moved to the window and peered out into the darkness. They're coming up the ridge trail. Must have found your tracks, despite the snow. Kevin grabbed his rifle and checked the ammunition. How long do we have? 20 minutes, maybe less if they're moving fast. Joan stood up, the blankets falling away from her shoulders. Her dress was still damp, but she had stopped shivering. The warmth of the cabin and the hot coffee had restored some of her strength. Is there another way out? She asked. Benjamin nodded toward the back of the cabin. Root cellar leads to a tunnel I dug during the war. Comes out about 50 yards up the ridge, hidden by trees. But it's a tight squeeze, and in this weather... Better than facing Frank Harris, Kevin said grimly. The voices were definitely getting closer now, and Joan could see the flickering glow of torches through the trees. Her heart began to race as she realized they were about to be trapped again. Go, Benjamin said, moving to gather supplies. I'll hold them off, give you time to get away. Benjamin, no, Kevin protested. They'll kill you. The older man smiled grimly. Maybe, but I've been in worse spots than this. Besides, someone needs to slow them down, or they'll catch you before you get 100 yards. Joan felt a stab of guilt at the thought of another person risking his life for her sake, but there was no time for arguments or second thoughts. The voices were close enough now that she could make out individual words, Frank Harris's voice cutting through the storm like a blade. Benjamin led them to the root cellar, pulling up a trapdoor that revealed a narrow tunnel disappearing into darkness. Follow it straight for about 100 feet, then angle left toward the surface. You'll come out in a grove of pine trees. Kevin went first, his rifle slung across his back. Joan followed, the narrow tunnel forcing her to crawl on hands and knees through cold mud and standing water. Behind them, she could hear Benjamin replacing the trapdoor and moving furniture to conceal their escape route. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, but finally Joan saw Kevin's boots disappear upward as he reached the exit. She followed, emerging into the storm-lashed night just as the sound of pounding on Benjamin's door echoed through the forest. They were free again, but for how long? And how many more people would have to risk their lives before Joan Miller could find a place where she truly belonged? As Kevin helped her to her feet in the grove of pine trees, Joan realized that the woman who had stood on the auction platform that morning was gone forever. In her place stood someone harder, someone who understood that survival sometimes required impossible choices, and that kindness was a rare gift to be treasured above all else. The storm continued to rage around them, but Joan no longer felt like its victim. She was a participant now in her own rescue, and whatever came next, she would face it with her eyes open and her spirit unbroken. Frank Harris and his men could chase her across every mountain in the territory, but they would never again find the helpless widow who had once stood trembling in her mourning dress. That woman had died somewhere on the trail between Kevin's cabin and Benjamin's door, and in her place had been born someone far more dangerous, someone who refused to be anyone's property ever again. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the forest as Frank Harris and his men forced their way into Benjamin's cabin. Joan and Kevin pressed themselves against the trunk of a massive pine tree, listening to the shouted questions and Benjamin's calm responses. They ain't here, Harris. Just me and my coffee. Don't lie to me, old man. We tracked them right to your door. Storm washes out a lot of tracks. Maybe you followed the wrong trail. Joan could hear the skepticism in Frank Harris's voice, the growing anger as his search failed to turn up his quarry. She held her breath, praying that Benjamin's deception would hold long enough for them to get away. Kevin touched her shoulder and pointed deeper into the forest. They needed to move while Harris and his men were distracted, put as much distance as possible between themselves and their pursuers. Joan nodded and followed him away from the cabin, stepping carefully to avoid breaking branches or disturbing the snow. They had gone perhaps 50 yards when a shout erupted from behind them. Someone had found the root cellar, discovered the tunnel. Their head start was gone. Run, Kevin whispered urgently, and they plunged into the forest at a pace that would have been reckless in daylight and was potentially suicidal in the storm-darkened night. Joan's dress caught on every branch and bramble, but she tore free without stopping. Her lungs burned from the thin mountain air and the effort of running uphill through deep snow. Behind them, she could hear voices spreading out through the forest, Harris's men beginning a systematic search. Kevin led her along what might have been a deer trail, though it was impossible to tell in the darkness. They climbed steadily, the terrain growing more rugged with each step. Joan's legs shook with exhaustion, but she forced herself to keep moving. The alternative was too terrible to contemplate. A gunshot cracked through the night, followed by another. Joan stumbled, thinking for a moment that they had been spotted, but Kevin kept moving without looking back. "Warning shots," he explained breathlessly, "trying to flush us out." They continued climbing, the storm showing no signs of abating. If anything, the wind seemed to be getting stronger, and the wet snow was turning to ice that made every step treacherous. Joan's hands were numb again despite the exertion, and she could no longer feel her feet. There, Kevin pointed ahead to what looked like a dark opening in the rock face. "Cave. We can rest for a few minutes." The cave was shallow but dry, offering blessed relief from the driving snow. Joan collapsed against the back wall, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Kevin crouched at the entrance, listening for sounds of pursuit. "Are they still following us?" Joan asked when she could finally speak. "Hard to tell in this weather, but we can't assume they have given up." Joan looked at Kevin's profile in the dim light filtering into the cave. His face was drawn with exhaustion, and she could see the toll their flight was taking on him. He was risking everything for her, and she still didn't fully understand why. "Tell me about Sarah," she said quietly. Kevin turned to look at her, surprise flickering in his eyes. "Why?" "Because I need to understand. You keep saying she would have expected this of you, but I need to know what kind of woman could inspire such loyalty." Kevin was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. "She was a teacher, like I said, but more than that, she was someone who believed people could be better than their circumstances. She used to say that kindness was the only thing that separated us from the animals." Joan could picture it, a young woman in a frontier schoolhouse, teaching children to read while their parents worked the mines and lumber camps. It would have been a hard life, isolated and dangerous, but there was something appealing about the simplicity of it. "How did she die?" Joan asked gently. "Fever took her during the winter of 1878. Started as a cold, but it got worse and worse until—" Kevin's voice trailed off. "I tried everything. Rode 20 miles through a blizzard to get the doctor. But by the time we got back, she was gone." Joan felt a stab of sympathy for this man who had lost his wife to the harsh realities of mountain life. She understood the guilt he must carry, the sense that he should have been able to save her somehow. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "She made me promise something before she died," Kevin continued. "Made me swear that I wouldn't let her death make me bitter, that I'd keep trying to help people the way she did." "Is that why you bought my debt?" "Part of it, but also because when I saw you standing on that platform in your mourning dress, you reminded me of her. Not in looks, but in the way you carried yourself. Dignified, even when everything was falling apart." Joan felt heat rise in her cheeks. She had never thought of herself as dignified, especially not during the humiliation of the auction. But perhaps Kevin saw something she couldn't see in herself. What was she like? Really like? Kevin smiled, the first genuine smile Joan had seen from him since they'd met. Stubborn as a mule when she thought she was right, which was most of the time. She could out-argue a circuit preacher and outshoot most of the men in the territory. But she was also gentle in ways that surprised people. She'd sit up all night with a sick child or spend her own money to buy books for students whose parents couldn't afford them. Joan tried to imagine what it would be like to be so secure in your own worth, so confident in your ability to make a difference in the world. It seemed like a foreign concept after months of feeling powerless and afraid. "Do you think she would have approved of what you're doing now?" Joan asked. "Running through a snowstorm with Frank Harris on our trail?" Kevin chuckled grimly. "Probably not. She always said I had more courage than sense. But helping me, taking on my problems." Kevin considered this seriously. "Yes, she would have done the same thing, probably done it better than I'm managing." Joan felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of fear and despair that had lived there since Thomas's death. For the first time in months, she felt like she might be worth saving, worth the risks Kevin was taking on her behalf. The sound of voices in the distance made them both freeze. Their pursuers were still out there, still searching through the storm. "We need to keep moving." Kevin said reluctantly. Can you make it a little further? Joan nodded, though she wasn't sure it was true. Her body was beyond exhaustion, running on nothing but determination and the knowledge that capture meant something worse than death. But she would keep going as long as Kevin was willing to lead. They left the cave and continued up the mountain, the terrain becoming increasingly treacherous. In some places, they had to climb over fallen trees or navigate around massive boulders that blocked their path. Joan's dress was in tatters now, torn by branches and rocks, but she no longer cared about appearances. The storm began to show signs of weakening as they climbed higher, the wind dropping to a steady moan rather than the howling fury it had been. Joan could see stars occasionally through breaks in the clouds, and the snow was becoming lighter and more manageable. How much further? She asked during a brief rest. Kevin consulted what appeared to be a compass, though Joan couldn't imagine how he could read it in the darkness. We're about halfway to the pass. If we can make it over the ridge before dawn, we might have a chance. Joan looked up at the towering peaks still ahead of them, their snow-covered slopes disappearing into the darkness. Halfway seemed impossibly optimistic, but she didn't have the energy to argue. They pressed on, following what Kevin claimed was a trail, though Joan could see no evidence of it. Her world had narrowed to the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other, of not falling behind the steady figure ahead of her. As they climbed, Joan found herself thinking about the woman she had been just that morning. The widow in mourning clothes who had stood on the auction platform had been passive, acted upon rather than acting. She had accepted her fate because she couldn't imagine any alternative. But the woman climbing this mountain in the middle of a storm was different. She was making choices, taking risks, refusing to accept the role of victim that circumstances had tried to force upon her. The transformation was as dramatic as it was unexpected. Joan, Kevin's voice broke through her reverie. Look. She followed his pointing finger and saw lights in the distance, warm and welcoming against the dark mountainside. For a moment, her heart leaped, thinking they had reached the settlement Kevin had mentioned. Then she realized the lights were behind them, moving through the forest they had just left. Frank Harris and his men were still following, and they were getting closer. How is that possible? Joan asked. We've been climbing for hours. They know these mountains better than I gave them credit for, Kevin admitted grimly. Probably took a shorter route, maybe even horses, part of the way. Joan felt despair creeping back into her chest. They had come so far, endured so much, only to have their pursuers closing the distance. Her legs were shaking with exhaustion, and she wasn't sure she could manage another mile, let alone the distance to the pass. Maybe I should surrender, she said quietly. End this before someone gets killed. Kevin turned to face her, his expression fierce in the starlight. No, we've come too far to give up now. But they're going to catch us anyway, and when they do, they'll probably kill you for helping me escape. Then we make sure they don't catch us. Kevin's confidence was reassuring, but Joan could see the exhaustion in his face, the way his shoulders sagged with fatigue. He was pushing himself as hard as she was, maybe harder, and there were limits to what even the strongest person could endure. How, Iman? She asked. Kevin looked around at the terrain surrounding them, his mind clearly working through possibilities. There, he pointed to what looked like a sheer rock face rising into the darkness. If we can make it up that cliff, they won't be able to follow on horseback. Might buy us enough time to reach the bus. Joan stared at the cliff, which looked impossibly steep and treacherous. In daylight with proper equipment, it would be a challenging climb. In darkness, exhausted and wearing a torn dress, it seemed like suicide. Can we really make it up there? I don't know, Kevin admitted. But I know we can't outrun them on level ground. Joan looked back at the lights moving through the forest below, then up at the cliff face that represented their only hope of escape. The choice was between certain capture and possible death, between surrender and one last desperate gamble. She thought about Thomas, about the life they had planned together that would never be. She thought about Sarah, the teacher who had believed people could rise above their circumstances. Most of all, she thought about the woman she was becoming, the one who refused to be anyone's property. Let's climb, she said. The cliff face was even more treacherous than it had appeared from below. What had looked like solid rock in the darkness turned out to be loose shale and crumbling limestone that shifted under their weight with every step. Joan's hands were raw and bleeding from gripping the sharp edges, and her dress kept catching on protruding stones. Kevin climbed ahead of her, testing each handhold before trusting his weight to it. More than once he had to find an alternate route when the rock proved too unstable to support them. Joan followed in his footsteps, trying not to look down at the growing drop below. "Don't think about the distance," Kevin called back to her quietly. "Just focus on the next handhold." Joan nodded, though she wasn't sure he could see her in the darkness. Her world had narrowed to the immediate, the feel of rock under her fingers, the burn in her muscles, the careful placement of each foot. Everything else, including the fear, had been pushed aside by the simple necessity of not falling. They climbed for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes. Joan's dress was now more holes than fabric, and she could feel blood from numerous cuts and scrapes soaking into the remaining cloth. But she kept moving, driven by the knowledge that Frank Harris and his men were somewhere below, probably trying to find a way to follow. "Almost there," Kevin whispered. Though Joan couldn't see any evidence of a top to the cliff, she forced herself to look up and was surprised to see that the rock face was indeed leveling out above them. They were perhaps 20 feet from what appeared to be a narrow ledge. The sight gave her a burst of energy she didn't know she still possessed. The last 20 feet were the hardest. The rock was more solid here, but also smoother, offering fewer handholds. Joan's arms shook with exhaustion as she pulled herself up inch by inch, her feet scrabbling for purchase on the nearly vertical surface. Kevin reached the ledge first and immediately turned to help her. His strong hands gripped her wrists and pulled her up the final few feet, and she collapsed onto the narrow shelf of rock, gasping for breath. "You did it," Kevin said, and she could hear the admiration in his voice. "I wasn't sure either of us was going to make it." Joan looked back down the cliff face that they had just climbed and felt a moment of dizzy disbelief. Had she really just scaled a sheer rock wall in the middle of a storm? The woman who had stood on the auction platform that morning would never have believed herself capable of such a thing. "Where are we today?" she asked when she could finally speak. Kevin was studying the terrain ahead of them, which seemed to open into a high mountain valley. "About a mile from the pass, I think. Once we get over that ridge, we'll be in different territory. Safer territory." Joan struggled to her feet, her legs unsteady after the climb. Her dress was beyond repair now, hanging in shreds that barely covered her. She was cold, exhausted, and covered in blood and dirt, but she was alive and free. "Can they follow us up here?" "Not easily. They'd have to go around, find another way up. That should give us several hours head start, maybe more." They began walking across the high valley, the going easier now on relatively level ground. The storm had mostly passed, leaving behind a crystal-clear night sky filled with more stars than Joan had ever seen. The beauty of it was almost overwhelming after the terror and struggle of the past few hours. "It's magnificent," she said softly. Kevin looked up at the star-filled sky and nodded. Sarah used to say that God painted his best work where only the brave could see it. Joan thought about that as they walked. She had never considered herself brave, but perhaps bravery wasn't about the absence of fear. Perhaps it was about continuing to move forward despite the fear, about refusing to let circumstances define your limits. The pass, when they finally reached it, was marked by a crude wooden sign that had been weathered nearly smooth by years of mountain storms. Joan couldn't make out the words in the darkness, but Kevin seemed to know where they were. "This is it," he said, "the dividing line. Once we cross over, we're in new territory." Joan looked back the way they had come, toward the valley where her old life had ended and this strange new chapter had begun. Somewhere down there, Frank Harris and his men were probably still searching, still trying to claim what they believed belonged to them. But the woman they were hunting no longer existed. She had died somewhere between the auction platform and this mountain pass, replaced by someone harder and stronger and infinitely more determined to control her own destiny. "What's on the other side?" Joan asked. "A settlement called Pine Ridge. About 30 families, mostly miners and loggers, but they're good people. They don't ask too many questions about where folks come from, and they don't take kindly to outsiders who cause trouble." Joan nodded, toying. though she wondered what kind of reception awaited a woman in a tattered mourning dress and with no money and no family. She had escaped Frank Harris, but she still had to figure out how to build a new life from nothing. As if reading her thoughts, Kevin said, "There's a woman there, Lisa Clark. She runs a boarding house and takes in people who need a fresh start. She'll help you get on your feet." "And then what?" Kevin was quiet for a moment. "Then you decide what kind of life you want to build. You're free now, Joan. Really free. No debts, no obligations, no one who can claim ownership over you." The concept of freedom was so foreign to Joan that she almost couldn't grasp it. For her entire life, she had been defined by her relationships to other people: daughter, wife, widow, debtor. The idea that she could simply choose her own path was both exhilarating and terrifying. They began the descent on the other side of the pass, following a trail that was better maintained than the rough paths they had been using. The going was easier here, and Joan felt some of her strength returning as they put more distance between themselves and their pursuers. "Kevin," she said as they walked, "why didn't you ever remarry after Sarah died?" He was quiet for so long that Joan thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "I guess I never met anyone who made me want to try again. Sarah and I had something special, and I didn't want to settle for less just to avoid being alone." Joan understood that sentiment. Her marriage to Thomas had been good, built on genuine love and respect. The idea of accepting something lesser just for the sake of companionship held no appeal. "Do you think you'll ever change your mind about that?" Kevin glanced at her, and even in the starlight she could see something shift in his expression. "Maybe, if I met the right person." There was something in his tone that made Joan's heart skip, a possibility she hadn't dared to consider. But this was neither the time nor the place for such thoughts. They were both exhausted, running from danger, and hardly in a position to make rational decisions about the future. The trail began to level out as they descended into a valley, and Joan could see lights in the distance. Not the threatening torches of their pursuers, but the warm glow of windows in houses where families slept safely. "Pine Ridge?" she asked. "Pine Ridge," Kevin confirmed. "We made it." Joan felt a surge of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. They had actually made it. Against all odds, despite the storm and the pursuit and the seemingly impossible climb, they had reached safety. "I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly. "You don't need to thank me. You saved yourself up there on that cliff. I just showed you the way." Joan thought about that as they approached the settlement. Perhaps Kevin was right. Perhaps the strength had been inside her all along, waiting for circumstances desperate enough to call it forth. The first building they reached was indeed a boarding house, marked by a simple wooden sign that read, "Clark's Lodging." Warm light spilled from the windows, and smoke rose from the chimney into the cold mountain air. Kevin knocked softly on the door, and after a few moments it opened to reveal a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair, pulled back in a practical bun. She took one look at Joan's torn dress and bloodied hands and immediately stepped aside to let them in. "Lisa Clark," she said by way of introduction. "And you two look like you've had a hard night of it." "This is Joan Miller," Kevin said. "She needs help." Lisa studied Joan's face with the practiced eye of someone who had seen many people at their lowest point. Whatever she saw, there seemed to satisfy her because she nodded and gestured toward a chair by the fire. "Sit down, dear. Let's get you warmed up and cleaned up, and then you can tell me what kind of help you need." Joan sank into the chair gratefully, the warmth of the fire almost painful against her frozen skin. For the first time since the auction that morning, she felt truly safe. "Thank you," she said to Lisa, then turned to Kevin. "Both of you." Kevin smiled, the exhaustion finally showing in his face now that the immediate danger was past. "Get some rest. We can figure out what comes next in the morning." As Lisa bustled around, preparing hot water and clean clothes, Joan found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this place. She had started the day as a victim, someone acted upon by forces beyond her control. She was ending it as a survivor, someone who had fought for her own freedom and won. The mourning dress that had marked her as a widow was now just rags, destroyed by her flight through the mountains. But perhaps that was fitting. The woman who had worn that dress was gone, replaced by someone stronger and more determined to shape her own destiny. Joan Miller had climbed a mountain in the darkness and found herself on the other side. Whatever came next, she would face it not as a victim, but as a woman who knew her own worth and refused to let anyone else define her value. The fire crackled in Lisa Clark's fireplace, and outside the windows of Pine Ridge, a new day was beginning to dawn. The morning light streaming through Lisa Clark's boarding house windows found Joan sitting by the fire, wearing a simple brown dress that Lisa had provided. The torn remnants of her morning dress lay in a pile beside her chair, black silk reduced to rags by her flight through the mountains. She stared at the ruined fabric, remembering the woman who had put it on that morning in preparation for an auction that seemed like a lifetime ago. Kevin sat across from her, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. The exhaustion of their night-long escape had settled into his features, but his eyes remained alert, watchful. Even in the safety of Pine Ridge, he couldn't quite let his guard down. "You should rest," Joan said quietly. "You've done enough." "Harris might still be out there," Kevin replied. "Won't rest easy until we know for certain." Lisa bustled into the room carrying a tray of breakfast, her practical demeanor unchanged despite having taken in two strangers in the middle of the night. She set plates before them and then settled into a third chair with her own cup of coffee. "Been thinking about your situation," Lisa said without preamble. "Pine Ridge could use a teacher. The last one moved on about 6 months ago, and the children have been making do with whatever their parents can manage." Joan looked up in surprise. "I'm not qualified to be a teacher." "Can you read and write?" "Yes, but can you cipher numbers and keep accounts?" "Of course, but that doesn't mean—" Lisa held up a hand to stop her protests. "That's more qualification than most folks out here have. The children need someone who cares about their learning, not someone with fancy certificates from back east." Kevin set down his coffee cup and studied Joan's face. "Sarah would have said the same thing. Teaching isn't about what you know. It's about helping others discover what they can learn." The mention of Sarah sent a familiar pang through Joan's chest. But this time it was accompanied by something else. A sense of possibility, perhaps, or the first stirring of a future she hadn't dared to imagine. "I wouldn't know where to start," Joan admitted. "With the children," Lisa said simply. "They'll teach you as much as you teach them." Before Joan could respond, the sound of horses in the street outside made all three of them freeze. Kevin was on his feet immediately, moving to the window to peer through the curtains. "3 riders," he reported grimly. "Coming this way." Joan felt her heart sink. After everything they had endured, had Frank Harris somehow tracked them to Pine Ridge? She moved to Kevin's side, looking out at the approaching horseman. The lead rider was a tall man with silver hair and a badge pinned to his vest. Behind him rode 2 younger men, both armed but not displaying the aggressive posture Joan had learned to associate with Harris and his crew. "Sheriff," Kevin said, relaxing slightly. "Not Harris." The 3 men dismounted and approached the boarding house, their boots echoing on the wooden porch. Lisa opened the door before they could knock, her expression neutral but welcoming. "Sheriff Rodriguez," she said, "what brings you to Pine Ridge so early in the morning?" "Morning, Lisa. I'm looking for a woman named Joan Miller. Got word she might be in these parts." Joan stepped forward, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. "I'm Joan Miller." Sheriff Rodriguez studied her face carefully, taking in the simple dress and the cuts on her hands that were still healing from the previous night on its climb. "Ma'am, I'm Gregory Rodriguez, sheriff for this territory. Need to ask you some questions about Frank Harris." "What about him?" Kevin interjected, moving to Joan's side. "He's dead," the sheriff said simply. "Found his body at the bottom of a ravine about 10 miles south of here. His horse came back to town without him, and we tracked his trail to where he fell." Joan felt the world shift around her, relief and shock warring in her chest. Frank Harris was dead. The man who had pursued her through the mountains, who had threatened to take her by force, would never be able to hurt her again. "When?" Kevin asked. "Sometime during the night. Best we can figure. Storm was bad, visibility near zero. Looks like his horse spooked and went over the edge." The sheriff paused, studying both Joan and Kevin. "His men say he was chasing after a woman who'd been stolen from him. They claim she belonged to him by right of debt." Joan found her voice. "That's not true. I was sold at a legal auction to settle my late husband's debts. Kevin Young paid the full amount." "Got papers to prove that?" Kevin reached into his jacket and pulled out the receipt from the auction, handing it to the sheriff. Rodriguez examined it carefully, then nodded and handed it back. "Seems like everything was legal and proper," he said. Harris's men tried to claim otherwise, but they couldn't produce any documentation for this supposed debt their boss was owed. One of the younger deputies spoke up. They were pretty eager to get back to the valley once they heard Harris was dead. Didn't seem interested in pursuing the matter further. Joan felt her knees go weak with relief. It was over. Really over. Frank Harris could never threaten her again, and his men had apparently decided she wasn't worth the trouble without their leader to drive them forward. "There is one more thing," Sheriff Rodriguez said. "Harris had a considerable sum of money on him when he died. No next of kin that we can locate, and his business debts exceed his assets. The money's going to go to the territorial government unless someone has a legitimate claim to it." Joan shook her head. "I don't want anything that belonged to him." "Might not be his to begin with," the sheriff continued. "Could be money he extorted from other folks, debts he collected that weren't rightfully owed. Territory's offering a reward for information about his business practices." Kevin and Joan exchanged glances. They both knew Harris had been planning to take Joan by force, regardless of any legitimate debt. How many others had suffered under his predatory schemes? "What kind of reward?" Kevin asked. $500 for information leading to the recovery of stolen property or fraudulent debts. Joan's breath caught. $500 was more money than she had ever seen in one place. It would be enough to start a new life, to build something real and lasting. "Harris tried to claim I owed him money for supplies my husband supposedly bought on credit," Joan said slowly. "But Thomas never mentioned any such debt, and Harris couldn't produce any paperwork to prove it." Sheriff Rodriguez nodded and pulled out a small notebook. "Tell me everything you remember about his claims." Joan recounted the events of the previous night, from Harris's arrival at Kevin's cabin to their desperate flight through the mountains. The sheriff took careful notes, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. "This matches what we've been hearing from other folks," Rodriguez said when she finished. "Harris had a pattern of claiming debts that couldn't be verified, then using intimidation to collect. You might not be the only one he tried this with." After the sheriff and his deputies left, Joan found herself sitting in Lisa's kitchen, staring at her hands and trying to process everything that had happened. Frank Harris was dead. She was free, and she might soon have enough money to truly start over. "Feeling overwhelmed?" Lisa asked, settling into the chair across from her. "I keep expecting to wake up," Joan admitted. "Yesterday morning I was being sold at auction. Now I'm free, Harris is dead, and I might have enough money to build a real life." "Money helps," Lisa said pragmatically, "but it's not what makes a life worth living. That comes from the choices you make and the people you choose to make them with." Joan glanced toward the main room, where Kevin was discussing something with one of the local men who had stopped by. Even in profile, she could see the strength in his features, the quiet dignity that had drawn her to trust him from the very beginning. "He saved me," Joan said quietly. "Did he, or did you save yourself?" Joan considered this. "Both, I think. He showed me I was worth saving, and then I found the strength to fight for it." Lisa smiled. "That's usually how it works. The best kind of help is the kind that teaches you to help yourself." Over the following weeks, Joan settled into life in Pine Ridge with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since before Thomas's death. The territorial government had indeed awarded her the $500 reward for information about Frank Harris's fraudulent practices, and several other victims had come forward with similar stories. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, a simple log building with large windows and a stone fireplace. Joan had spent days cleaning and organizing it, preparing for the dozen children who would soon become her students. The work felt right in a way she hadn't expected, as if she was finally doing something she was meant to do. Kevin had stayed in Pine Ridge, ostensibly to help with repairs to the school, but really, Joan suspected, because he wasn't ready to leave her yet. They had grown closer during their shared ordeal, but both seemed uncertain about what that meant for their future. On a crisp October morning, Joan stood in front of her first class of students. They ranged in age from 6 to 14, children of miners and loggers and shopkeepers who had never had consistent schooling. Their faces were eager and curious, reminding her of Sarah's description of teaching as helping others discover what they could learn. "Good morning," Joan said, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "My name is Miss Miller, and I'm going to be your teacher." A hand shot up from the back of the room. "Miss Miller, are you the lady who climbed the cliff in the storm?" Joan smiled. News traveled fast in small communities, and her dramatic arrival in Pine Ridge had become something of a local legend. "I am, and that climb taught me something important about what we can accomplish when we refuse to give up." The days settled into a rhythm of lessons and learning, of watching young minds grasp new concepts and expand their understanding of the world. Joan found herself thinking often of Sarah, the teacher who had inspired such devotion in Kevin. She began to understand what had drawn him to his late wife, the satisfaction that came from nurturing growth and potential in others. Kevin visited the school regularly, helping with repairs and maintenance, but also, Joan noticed, finding excuses to spend time in her company. Their conversations grew longer and more personal, touching on dreams and fears and the possibility of futures neither had dared to imagine. One evening in late October, as Joan was cleaning the schoolhouse after a particularly challenging day with the older boys, Kevin appeared in the doorway carrying a cup of coffee and wearing an expression she had learned to associate with serious conversations. "Thought you might need this," he said, offering her the coffee. Joan accepted it gratefully, settling into one of the student desks while Kevin took another. The familiar ritual of sharing coffee had become a cornerstone of their developing relationship, a moment of quiet connection at the end of busy days. "The children are talking about you," Joan said with a smile. "Apparently you're quite the hero in their eyes." Kevin looked uncomfortable with the praise. "Just helped where I could. You did more than that, and you know it." Joan studied his face in the lamplight. "The question is, what happens now?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, you've been staying in Pine Ridge for weeks now. Your cabin is sitting empty, your life on hold. At some point, you're going to have to decide what you really want." Kevin was quiet for a long moment, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful and certain. "What I want is complicated. Try me. I want to stay here, near you. I want to see what might develop between us, given time and opportunity." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "But I don't want you to feel obligated to me because of what happened. You're free now, Joan, really free. You shouldn't feel like you owe me anything." Joan felt something warm unfurl in her chest, a recognition of the careful respect Kevin was showing for her autonomy. After months of being treated like property, his insistence on her right to choose was both touching and liberating. "What if I don't want to be free of you?" she asked quietly. Kevin's breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that what happened between us in those mountains wasn't just about survival. It was about two people finding something worth fighting for." Joan set down her coffee and moved closer to him. "I'm saying that maybe Sarah was right about kindness being what separates us from animals, and maybe she'd understand that sometimes kindness can grow into something deeper." Kevin reached out tentatively, his fingers brushing against her hand. "Are you sure? After everything you've been through, the last thing you need is to feel pressured into another relationship." Joan smiled, remembering the terrified woman who had stood on the auction platform in her mourning dress. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who knew her own mind and wasn't afraid to speak it. "I'm not being pressured into anything. I'm choosing. For the first time in my adult life, I'm making a choice based on what I want, not what's expected of me or what circumstances force on me." Kevin's hand closed around hers, warm and strong and reassuring. "Then yes, I want to stay. I want to see what we might build together." Joan felt tears threaten, but they were tears of guilt rather than sorrow. "What would Sarah think?" "She'd be happy for us," Kevin said with certainty. "She always said that love wasn't a finite resource, that caring for one person didn't diminish your ability to care for others. She'd want both of us to be happy." The mention of love sent a flutter through Joan's chest. They hadn't spoken the word yet, but she could feel it growing between them, strong and sure, and built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared trials. "The children have been asking when you're going to marry me," Joan said with a laugh. Kevin's eyes widened. "Have they now?" Apparently, our courtship is the most interesting thing happening in Pine Ridge. They've been taking bets on when you'll finally ask. And what did you tell them? Joan stood and moved to the window, looking out at the mountains that had witnessed her transformation from victim to survivor to woman in love. I told them that some things can't be rushed, that the best decisions come from taking time to be sure. Kevin joined her at the window, his reflection visible beside hers in the glass. And are you sure? Joan turned to face him, seeing in his eyes the same certainty she felt in her own heart. I'm sure that I love you. I'm sure that what we have is worth building a life around. And I'm sure that Sarah would approve of the man you've become and the choices you've made. Kevin's smile was radiant, transforming his weathered features with joy. Then Joan Miller, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Yes, Joan said without hesitation. Yes, I will. As Kevin pulled her into his arms, Joan caught sight of their reflection in the schoolhouse window. Two people who had found each other in the midst of loss and danger, who had chosen to build something beautiful from the ashes of their separate griefs. The mourning dress was long gone, destroyed in their flight through the mountains, but Joan no longer needed it to honor Thomas's memory. She would carry his love with her always, just as Kevin would carry Sarah's. But they were ready now to create something new, something that honored the past while embracing the future. Outside the window, snow was beginning to fall on the mountains of Pine Ridge, the first snow of winter. But inside the schoolhouse, warmed by love and the promise of tomorrow, Joan Miller had never felt more alive. The wedding took place on a crisp November morning in the Pine Ridge Church, a simple ceremony attended by the entire community. Joan wore a dress of deep blue wool that Lisa Clark had helped her sew, a far cry from the black silk that had marked her as a widow. The transformation was complete in more ways than one. Benjamin Alvarez had made the journey from his mountain cabin to serve as Kevin's best man, his weathered face beaming with approval as he watched his friend take his vows. The children from Joan's school served as an impromptu choir, their voices raised in a hymn that echoed off the log walls of the small church. Do you, Kevin Young, take Joan Miller to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for as long as you both shall live? I do, Kevin said, his voice strong and sure. Do you, Joan Miller, take Kevin Young to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for as long as you both shall live? Joan looked into Kevin's eyes and saw her future reflected there, a future built on choice rather than circumstance, on love rather than obligation. I do. The kiss that sealed their union was gentle and sweet, witnessed by a community that had embraced them both and blessed their decision to build a life together. As they walked down the aisle as husband and wife, Joan felt the last vestiges of her old identity fall away. She was no longer the widow in mourning clothes, no longer the woman sold at auction to settle debts. She was Joan Young now, teacher and wife, a woman who had claimed her own destiny and found love in the process. The celebration that followed was held in the schoolhouse, transformed for the occasion with wildflowers and candles. The entire community had contributed food and music, creating a feast that lasted well into the evening. Joan found herself surrounded by friends she hadn't known she had. People who had accepted her not despite her past, but because of the strength she had shown in overcoming it. Speech! Someone called out, and the crowd took up the cry. Kevin stood, raising his cup of cider. I'm not much for speeches, he began, earning chuckles from those who knew him well. But I want to say something about second chances. The room grew quiet, everyone leaning in to hear his words. 6 months ago, I thought my life was over. I'd lost the woman I loved, and I couldn't see a way forward. Then I met Joan, and she showed me that sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of another. Joan felt tears prick her eyes as Kevin continued. She taught me that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right even when you're afraid. She climbed a mountain in a storm to claim her freedom. And in doing so, she freed me too. The applause that followed was heartfelt and prolonged, but Joan barely heard it. She was thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment, the trials and terrors that had ultimately led to joy. As the evening wound down and guests began to make their way home, Joan found herself standing on the schoolhouse steps with Kevin, looking up at the star-filled sky. The same stars that had witnessed their desperate flight through the mountains now blessed their union. "Any regrets?" Kevin asked softly. Joan considered the question seriously. "About marrying you? None. About the path that brought us here?" She paused, thinking of Thomas and the life they had shared, of the auction and the terror of Frank Harris's pursuit. "I wouldn't change any of it. Even the painful parts led me to you." Kevin pulled her closer, and Joan marveled at how safe she felt in his arms. Not the helpless safety of someone being protected, but the confident safety of someone who, she could protect herself but chose to share that strength with another. They had decided to make their home in Pine Ridge, at least for now. Kevin's cabin would remain as a retreat, a place to escape to when the demands of community life became too much. But their real life would be here among the people who had welcomed them and the children Joan taught. The schoolhouse had become more than just a place of learning. It was a symbol of Joan's transformation, a testament to her refusal to be defined by circumstances beyond her control. Every morning when she stood before her students, she was reminded that growth and change were always possible, that even the most difficult situations could lead to unexpected opportunities. Winter settled over Pine Ridge with unusual gentleness, as if the mountains themselves were blessing the newlyweds. Joan and Kevin fell into the rhythms of married life with an ease that surprised them both. They had been through enough together that the small adjustments of sharing a home seemed insignificant. Kevin found work helping to expand the school, building additional classrooms to accommodate the growing number of families moving to Pine Ridge. Joan's teaching had attracted attention from other communities, and parents were relocating specifically to ensure their children could receive a proper education. "You're becoming famous," Kevin teased one evening as they sat by their fireplace, Joan grading papers while he whittled a new set of blocks for the younger students. "Hardly famous," Joan replied, but she couldn't hide her pleasure at the recognition. "Just doing what needs to be done." "Sarah would be proud of you," Kevin said quietly. She always believed that education was the key to breaking cycles of poverty and ignorance. Joan looked up from her papers, studying her husband's face in the firelight. They had learned to speak of Sarah naturally, without the awkwardness that might have existed if Joan had been jealous of Kevin's first wife. Instead, she felt connected to the woman who had shaped the man she loved, grateful for the lessons Sarah had taught him about kindness and service. "I think about her sometimes when I'm teaching," Joan admitted, wondering what she would have done in certain situations, how she would have handled difficult students or resistant parents. "What do you think she would say about your methods?" Joan smiled. "I think she would say that teaching is about meeting students where they are, not where you think they should be. That patience and understanding accomplish more than rigid discipline." Kevin nodded approvingly. "She would have liked you very much." As spring approached, Joan realized she was carrying Kevin's child. The discovery filled her with a joy she had never expected to feel again. After losing Thomas and enduring the auction and everything that followed, she had assumed her childbearing years were behind her. "Are you happy?" she asked Kevin when she told him the news. His response was to sweep her into his arms and spin her around their small kitchen, both of them laughing with delight. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," he said when he finally set her down. "Terrified, grateful, overwhelmed, but yes, incredibly happy." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Joan continued teaching until the final weeks before the baby was due. Her students were fascinated by the changes in their teacher, asking endless questions about babies and birth and what it meant to become a mother. "Will you still be our teacher after the baby comes?" asked Karen James, one of Joan's favorite students. "Of course," Joan assured her. "Babies sleep a lot, and I imagine I'll need something to keep my mind occupied during the day." The truth was more complicated than that, but Joan was confident she could manage both motherhood and teaching. She had learned to adapt to circumstances, to find strength she didn't know she possessed. On a warm day in early summer, Joan gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah, honoring the woman whose influence had brought them together. The baby was healthy and strong, with Kevin's dark hair and Joan's determined chin. As Joan held her daughter for the first time, she thought about the woman who had stood on the auction platform less than a year before. That woman could never have imagined this moment, could never have believed that such happiness was possible. "What are you thinking about?" Kevin asked, settling beside them on the bed. "About how far we've traveled," Joan replied. "Not just in miles, but in every way that matters." Kevin reached out to stroke their daughter's tiny hand, his expression tender. "She'll never know what it's like to be powerless. We'll make sure of that." Joan nodded, understanding the promise implicit in his words. Their daughter would grow up knowing she had choices, that her worth wasn't determined by others, but by her own actions and decisions. The years that followed brought changes to Pine Ridge into the young family. Joan returned to teaching when Sarah was old enough, carrying the baby to school and managing both roles with the same determination that had carried her through her darkest days. More children followed, two sons who inherited their father's quiet strength and their mother's fierce independence. The family grew and thrived, becoming pillars of the Pine Ridge community. Joan's reputation as a teacher spread throughout the territory, and she began training other women to establish schools in remote communities. The work was demanding but fulfilling, a way of ensuring that what had happened to her, the powerlessness and vulnerability that came with ignorance and dependence, would be less likely to happen to others. Kevin expanded his carpentry work, building not just furniture and houses, but also schools and community centers throughout the region. His craftsmanship became legendary, but more than that, his integrity and kindness made him a natural leader in the growing community. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the demands of daily life temporarily set aside, Joan and Kevin would sit on their porch and watch the sun set behind the mountains. These moments of peace were precious, reminders of how far they had traveled from that storm-lashed night when they first climbed toward freedom. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been at that auction?" Joan asked one evening, their youngest son sleeping in her arms while their daughter played at their feet. Kevin considered the question seriously. "I try not to think about alternate paths. This is the life we have, the one we chose and built together. Wondering about what might have been seems like a waste of the blessings we've received." Joan nodded, understanding his perspective. She had learned to focus on the present rather than dwelling on past sorrows or future uncertainties. The woman who had been paralyzed by grief and circumstances was gone, replaced by someone who understood that life was about making choices and living with their consequences. As the children grew older, Joan began to tell them the story of how their parents had met. Not the full truth, which would have been inappropriate for young ears, but a simplified version that emphasized themes of courage, kindness, and the importance of helping others. "Mama was in trouble," she would say, and Papa helped her find her way to safety. But the most important part was that Mama learned to help herself too. Sarah, now old enough to understand more complex ideas, asked the questions Joan had been expecting. What kind of trouble? Why did she need help? Joan chose her words carefully. Sometimes life puts us in situations where we feel powerless, where other people try to make decisions for us that we should make for ourselves. When that happened to me, your father showed me that I was stronger than I thought, that I could fight for what I believed was right. And then you fell in love. Joan smiled at her daughter's romantic interpretation. And then we discovered that we made each other better people. Love isn't just about feelings, Barnett. It's about choosing to build something together, to support each other through good times and difficult ones. The lessons Joan taught her children were the same ones she shared with her students: the importance of education, the value of hard work, and the understanding that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. She had learned these truths the hard way, and she was determined that others would learn them more gently. As Pine Ridge grew from a rough mining settlement into a proper town, Joan found herself increasingly involved in civic affairs. She served on the school board, helped establish a library, and worked to ensure that the community's growth didn't come at the expense of its values. Kevin supported these efforts while pursuing his own projects, including a workshop where he taught young men the carpentry skills that could provide them with honest livelihoods. Together, they became the kind of couple that communities build themselves around, steady and reliable, and committed to the common good. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Joan and Kevin returned to the cliff where they had climbed to freedom all those years before. The trail was better marked now, and what had seemed like an impossible ascent in the darkness of a storm was revealed to be challenging but manageable. "I can't believe we made it up here in the dark," Joan said, looking down at the valley below. I can't believe you made it up here in a dress, Kevin replied, earning a laugh from his wife. They stood together at the top of the cliff, their children playing nearby, and Joan reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The woman who had climbed this cliff in terror and desperation was still part of her, but she was no longer defined by that experience. Thank you, Joan said quietly. For what? For seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself. For believing I was worth saving when I had stopped believing it myself. Kevin pulled her close, and Joan marveled at how natural the gesture had become after years of marriage. You saved yourself, Joan. I has provided the opportunity. As they made their way back down the mountain, Joan thought about the mourning dress she had worn to the auction so many years before. She had grieved for Thomas, honored his memory, and then moved forward into a new life. The dress was gone, but the lessons it represented remained. That loss was part of life. That grief was the price of love, and that healing was possible even after the deepest wounds. Their children ran ahead on the trail, their laughter echoing off the mountain walls. Joan watched them with the satisfaction of a woman who had not only survived her trials, but had used them to build something beautiful and lasting. The sun was setting as they reached their home in Pine Ridge, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Joan paused on the threshold, looking back at the mountains that had witnessed her transformation from victim to survivor to woman fulfilled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to grow and serve and love. But tonight, surrounded by family and community, Joan Young stood as living proof that even the darkest circumstances could lead to unexpected light. She had been auctioned off while wearing her mourning dress, treated like property to be bought and sold. But she had refused to accept that definition of her worth. Instead, she had climbed mountains, both literal and metaphorical, claimed her freedom, and built a life of purpose and joy. The mourning dress was long gone, but the woman who had worn it had become something far more valuable: a teacher, a mother, a partner, and a pillar of her community. She had learned that true strength came not from avoiding difficulty, but from facing it with courage and grace. As Joan closed the door behind her family and began the evening routines that marked the end of another day, she carried with her the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. She had been tested by circumstances that could have broken her, but instead they had revealed depths of strength and resilience she had never known she possessed. The mountains stood silent and eternal outside her windows, witnesses to all the human drama that played out in their shadows. But Joan no longer felt dwarfed by their immensity. She had climbed them once in darkness and terror, and in doing so had discovered that she was capable of far more than she had ever imagined. The woman in the mourning dress was gone, but her legacy lived on in every student Joan taught, every life she touched, and every choice she made to build rather than tear down. She had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of countless others, proving that even the most desperate circumstances could be the beginning of something beautiful. Joan Young smiled as she tucked her children into bed, kissed her husband goodnight, and prepared for sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but she would face them as she had learned to face everything, with courage, with grace, and with the unshakable knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged. Her